The year is 1878. The westward expansion is a fever drawing souls to the promise of a new life under the vast, unforgiving sky. But for every homesteader who finds their fortune, another finds only dust and despair. This is a story of the latter, a story of a woman named Eleanor, a mail-order bride who traveled 1,000 miles for a love she'd only known through letters. She sought a home, but found a nightmare snatched from her new life by ruthless outlaws. But they made one mistake. They left a trail, and on that trail, a lone Apache tracker, a man with ghosts in his eyes, and a sworn vendetta would cross the burning desert to find her. What follows is a tale of survival betrayal and the brutal reality of the Wild West. The stagecoach bucked and swayed a wooden ship on a sea of ochre dust. Inside, Eleanor Vance felt every jolt in her bones, a stark welcome to the Arizona territory. For months, the journey had been a blur of changing landscapes, a relentless forward motion away from the suffocating propriety of Boston, and towards a future she had only dared to dream of. That dream had a name: William Blackwood. His letters, penned in a surprisingly delicate hand, spoke of a sprawling ranch under a sky so wide it could hold a lifetime of hopes. He wrote of partnership, of building a life together, of a gentle love that stood in stark contrast to the harshness of the land he described. As the coach crested a final rise, the town of Redemption came into view. It was less a town, and more a collection of weathered buildings clinging to life in the shadow of the Dragoon Mountains. The air was thin and carried the scent of pine dust and something else, a faint, almost imperceptible tang of desperation. Eleanor, clutching the worn photograph of William, felt a tremor of apprehension. The man in the picture was handsome, with kind eyes and a sturdy set jaw, but a photograph couldn't capture the essence of a man, any more than his letters could capture the crushing immensity of this land. The stage shuddered to a halt in front of a long, low building that served as the town's hotel saloon and general store. A small crowd had gathered, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apathy. Eleanor scanned the faces, searching for the one from the photograph. A man detached himself from the crowd and strode forward. He was tall and well-built, but his eyes were not the kind ones from the picture. They were a pale, cold blue, and they appraised her with an unnerving intensity. "Mrs. Blackwood," he asked, his voice a low rumble that did nothing to soothe her jangled nerves. Yes. I am Miss Vance. You must be William." A slow smile spread across his face, but it didn't reach his eyes. The one and only. "Welcome to Redemption, Eleanor." He took her bags, his touch surprisingly rough, and led her towards a wagon. The townspeople watched them go, their whispers following her like a swarm of unseen insects. In the saloon, a man with a silver star pinned to his vest watched them through the grimy window. Sheriff Jebediah Stone had a nose for trouble, and the arrival of the mail-order bride, coupled with the edgy demeanor of William Blackwood, had his full attention. The Blackwood Ranch was a good hour's ride from town. The landscape grew wilder, the sense of isolation more profound. The ranch house, when it finally came into view, was a sturdy two-story structure, but it had a neglected air. The corrals were in need of repair, and the fields lay fallow. It was not the thriving enterprise William's letters had described. "It needs a woman's touch," William said, as if reading her thoughts. "I've been so busy establishing the boundaries, dealing with local disputes." That night, Eleanor lay in the unfamiliar bed, the silence of the desert pressing in on her. The man who slept in the room down the hall was a stranger. His words were a discordant echo of the letters she had cherished. The gentle, poetic man who had captured her heart on paper, was nowhere to be found in the brusque, watchful man who was to be her husband. 2 days later, the world shattered. They were eating a silent breakfast when the sound of approaching horses broke the morning stillness. William's head snapped up, the color draining from his face. He looked not alarmed, but terrified. "Get in the cellar!" He hissed, his eyes wide with a fear that seemed to go beyond the threat of a simple robbery. But it was too late. The door burst open, and 3 men filled the doorway. They were hard-bitten and carried their rifles with a casual menace. The man who led them was tall and lean, with a jagged scar that pulled one side of his mouth into a permanent sneer. His eyes, the color of obsidian, were fixed on Eleanor. "Well, well, Blackwood," the man drawled, his voice like gravel. "Looks like you've got yourself some new livestock." William stood frozen, his hands half raised in a gesture of supplication. "Kane, I can explain. I just need more time." The man named Kane Kincaid laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Time is something you've run out of. I'm here to collect what I'm owed." His eyes swept over Eleanor again, and a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. "And I see you've brought me a down payment." He gestured with his rifle, and one of his men grabbed Eleanor's arm. She cried out, struggling against his iron grip. She looked at William, her eyes pleading with him to do something. But her intended husband stood as if turned to stone, his face a mask of abject terror. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched as they dragged her out of the house and threw her onto a horse. As they rode away, Eleanor looked back at the ranch, at the man she had crossed a continent to marry. He was a small, pathetic figure, standing in the doorway of his neglected home, a silent witness to her abduction. The dream had dissolved into a brutal nightmare, and as the desert swallowed her whole, a single chilling thought consumed her. William. Blackwood hadn't been a victim of the Outlaws. He had been a partner. The news of the kidnapping spread through Redemption like a brush fire. It was the talk of the saloon, the general store, and the dusty street corners. A woman of refinement, a mail-order bride from the East, snatched from her home in broad daylight. The story was a thrilling diversion from the monotony of frontier life, a fresh piece of gossip to be chewed over and savored. Sheriff Jebediah Stone, however, found no thrill in it. He sat in his office, the flimsy walls doing little to block out the buzz of speculation from the saloon next door. He had ridden out to the Blackwood ranch as soon as he'd heard the news. He'd found William Blackwood sitting at his kitchen table, a bottle of whiskey in his hand and a vacant look in his eyes. Blackwood's story was full of holes. He claimed a band of marauding Apaches had taken his bride, a convenient and all too common scapegoat in this part of the territory. But Stone had seen the tracks of shod horses, not the unshod ponies of the Apache. And he had seen the look in Blackwood's eyes, not the grief of a bereaved husband, but the fear of a man whose carefully constructed world was about to crumble. Stone knew of Kane Kincaid. The man was a vulture who preyed on the weak and the desperate. He ran a gang of cutthroats who specialized in rustling robbery, and when the price was right, kidnapping. Stone had a suspicion, a gut feeling that gnawed at him, that this was no random act of violence. It was a business transaction gone wrong. Miles away in the high, hidden canyons of the Chiricahua Mountains, the news of Eleanor's abduction arrived not as gossip, but as a somber message carried on the wind. It reached a small, secluded Apache encampment, a pocket of resistance against the encroaching tide of the white man. Here the name Kane Kincaid was spoken with a venom reserved for the most hated of enemies. Among the warriors was a man known as Nantan. He was not Chiricahua by birth, but had been raised among them after his own people. The Lipan Apache had been decimated. Nantan was a man of few words, his face a stoic mask that concealed a pain that ran as deep as the canyons themselves. He was a tracker, and his skills were legendary. It was said he could read the land like a book, that he could follow a trail a week old across bare rock. When the news of the kidnapping was brought to the Council of Elders, Nantan listened in silence. He heard the name Blackwood and the fabricated story of the Apache raid, but it was the name Kincaid that stirred the embers of a cold fire in his soul. He had a personal score to settle with Cain Kincaid, a debt that could only be paid in blood. Years ago, Kincaid's gang had raided a peaceful Lipan camp, a camp where Nantan's wife and young son had been living. They had been slaughtered, along with many others, in a senseless act of brutality. Nantan had been away on a hunt, and he had returned to a scene of unimaginable horror. He had buried his family with his own hands, and on their graves he had sworn an oath of vengeance. He had hunted Kincaid ever since a relentless, solitary pursuit. He had come close a few times, but the outlaw was as cunning as a coyote, always managing to slip through his grasp. Now fate had presented him with a new trail, a fresh scent. This woman, this mail-order bride, was now a pawn in his long and bitter game. That night, as a sliver of a moon cast a ghostly light over the mountains, Nantan made his preparations. He took his bow and a quiver of arrows, a knife that had been his father's, a small pouch of dried meat, and a water skin. He wore a simple breechcloth and moccasins that made no sound on the rocky ground. He was a ghost, a whisper in the wilderness. He went to the sacred place of his ancestors, a high cliff overlooking the vast expanse of the desert, and he prayed. He prayed not for his own safety, but for the strength to see his quest through to its bitter end. As the first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky, Nantan descended from the mountains. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, his eyes scanning the horizon. He was not just a tracker, he was an avenger. The desert, a place of death for so many, was his sanctuary. It was a harsh and unforgiving mistress, but it was also his ally. It would test him, push him to his limits, but it would also guide him. He picked up the trail at the Blackwood Ranch, a place he approached with the caution of a wolf circling a sheep pen. He ignored the clumsy, obvious tracks of the sheriff's posse, his eyes searching for the fainter, more subtle signs left by Kincaid's gang. He found what he was looking for, a dropped shell casing from a rifle not commonly used in the area, a series of hoof prints that indicated horses being ridden hard, a single out-of-place strand of dark fabric caught on a thorny bush. The trail led him east towards the sun-scorched plains of the Sulphur Springs Valley. It was a desolate and dangerous land, a place where a man could die of thirst in a matter of hours. But Nantan was not just any man. He was Apache, and he was on the hunt. The hunter's moon had passed, but for Cain Kincaid, the reckoning was just beginning. The desert was a furnace. The sun beat down with a merciless intensity, bleaching the landscape to a uniform shade of pale brown. For Eleanor, the world had been reduced to the rhythmic sway of the horse, the creak of leather, and the coarse, mocking laughter of her captors. The men of Cain Kincaid's gang were a study in brutality. They were unwashed, uncouth, and their conversation was a litany of profanities and cruel jokes. They treated her not as a person, but as a piece of property, a valuable commodity to be traded or sold. Cain Kincaid rode at the head of the small column, a dark, brooding presence. He rarely spoke to Eleanor, but she could feel his eyes on her, a chilling proprietary gaze that made her skin crawl. She had tried to appeal to him once to reason with him, but he had simply laughed the sound as dry and brittle as the desert scrub. Reason, he had sneered. There's no reason out here, little lady. There's only survival. And you're my ticket to it. Eleanor soon realized that her only hope for survival lay in her own wits. She was a woman of education and refinement, her skills honed in the drawing rooms of Boston. But the desert cared little for a knowledge of literature or a talent for watercolor painting. It demanded a different kind of intelligence, a primal cunning she never knew she possessed. She began to leave a trail, a series of small, seemingly insignificant clues for anyone who might be following. She had been wearing a string of mother-of-pearl buttons on her traveling dress, and one by one she worked them loose, dropping them at intervals. When the buttons were gone, she snagged a thread from her sleeve, a vibrant blue against the drab landscape. She feigned a stumble as she was dismounting one evening, and pressed a small, distinctive brooch from her mother into the soft earth beneath a mesquite tree. It was a desperate, almost hopeless gesture, a message in a bottle cast into a sea of sand. Life in the Outlaws' camp was a living hell. They made camp in hidden arroyos and secluded box canyons, always on the move, always watchful. The food was scarce and of poor quality. Hardtack and greasy bacon washed down with gritty coffee. The nights were cold, and she was given only a thin, threadbare blanket for warmth. She slept fitfully, haunted by nightmares and the leering faces of her captors. There were 4 men in the gang, besides Kincaid. There was a hulking, slow-witted man named Jed, whose loyalty to Kincaid was absolute. There was a wiry, rat-faced man called Silas, who seemed to take a particular delight in her misery. And there was a young, almost boyish outlaw, who went by the name of Kid. He was quiet and watchful, and unlike the others, he rarely joined in the crude banter. Eleanor noticed that he would sometimes look at her with something akin to pity in his eyes. He was her only glimmer of humanity in this brutal, unforgiving world. Meanwhile, Nantan followed the trail with a patience born of long practice. He moved through the desert like a ghost, his senses attuned to the subtle language of the land. He found the pearl buttons glinting like scattered teeth in the harsh sunlight. He found the blue thread, a tiny slash of color against the dun earth. He found the brooch, its delicate design a stark contrast to the rugged terrain. He saw these not as the desperate acts of a helpless victim, but as the calculated moves of an intelligent and courageous woman. He was not just tracking a group of outlaws. He was following the trail of a survivor. His respect for this unknown woman grew with every clue she left. He began to feel a strange connection to her, a sense of responsibility that went beyond his quest for vengeance. She was no longer just a pawn in his game. She was a fellow warrior, fighting her own battle in her own way. Nantan's journey was a testament to his incredible endurance and skill. He drank from hidden springs known only to the Apache. He ate the roots of desert plants, and he supplemented his meager supplies with the occasional snake or lizard roasted over a smokeless fire. He traveled light and fast, his body honed by a lifetime of hardship. The desert was his ally, but it was also a formidable foe. He endured sandstorms that blotted out the sun and reduced visibility to a few feet. He navigated treacherous canyons where a single misstep could mean a fatal fall. He faced the constant threat of rattlesnakes and scorpions, but he pressed on his resolve unshaken. One evening, as he made his own cold camp, he held one of the pearl buttons in his hand. It was small and smooth, a fragile thing to have survived this harsh land. He thought of the woman who had dropped it, a woman he had never met, but for whom he was risking everything. He thought of his wife, of her gentle touch and her soft laughter. The two images, the known and the unknown, merged in his mind. The fire of his vengeance was now tempered by something else, something he couldn't quite name. It was a sense of duty, of honor, of a shared humanity in the face of overwhelming brutality. He was no longer just a hunter. He was a protector, and he would not fail. Back in Redemption, Sheriff Jebediah Stone was a man possessed. The official story, the one Blackwood was peddling and the townsfolk were eagerly consuming, was that a band of renegade Apaches had taken the mail-order bride. A posse had been formed, a collection of drunken hotheads and glory-seekers who rode out with a great deal of bravado and returned a few days later empty-handed and blaming the cunning of the savages. Stone had not joined them. He knew it was a fool's errand. The trail he was interested in didn't lead into the mountains. It led directly back to the dark, tangled secrets of William Blackwood. He began to dig quietly and methodically. He sent a telegraph to a contact in Prescott, the territorial capital, asking for any information on Cain Kincaid. He spent hours in the saloon, not drinking, but listening. In the Wild West, whiskey loosened tongues, and a man with a patient ear could learn a great deal. His investigation led him to a disgruntled former hand of Blackwood's, a man named Henderson, who had been fired a few months back. Stone found him nursing a cheap bottle of rye in a back-alley gambling den. It took a few silver dollars and the promise of another bottle, but Henderson's resentment was a wellspring of information. Blackwood Henderson slurred, his eyes red-rimmed and bitter. He ain't no rancher. He's a gambler who got in over his head. Owed a powerful lot of money to some unsavory types. What kind of types? Stone pressed his voice low and even. The kind that don't take kindly to being kept waiting. Heard talk of a man named Kincaid. A real devil, they say. Henderson took a long pull from the bottle Stone had provided. Blackwood was desperate. Sold off most of his breeding stock for a fraction of what they was worth. Even tried to sell a piece of his land. But the deed is all tangled up in his family's estate back east. The pieces began to click into place for Stone. Blackwood was in debt to Kincaid. The mail-order bride, a woman of good family from Boston, was not a partner in a new life, but a pawn in a desperate gamble. Blackwood must have promised her dowry, or perhaps her family's wealth to Kincaid as payment. And when that payment wasn't forthcoming, Kincaid had come to collect the collateral. Stone's suspicions were confirmed by the reply to his telegraph. Cain Kincaid was wanted in 3 territories for a string of violent crimes, including kidnapping for ransom. His preferred victims were those with wealthy families, who would pay a hefty price for their safe return. The sheriff now faced a dilemma. He had the truth, or at least the ugly shape of it, but it was a truth built on the ramblings of a drunk and the whispers of the saloon. He had no hard evidence, nothing that would stand up in front of a judge. And Redemption was a town that valued its own version of order. To accuse a man like Blackwood, a landowner, of being in league with outlaws, was a serious charge, one that could tear the fragile fabric of the community apart. Meanwhile, out in the vast, unforgiving wilderness, another kind of truth was beginning to surface. In the outlaw camp, Eleanor's quiet defiance and her unexpected resilience were having an effect on the youngest member of the gang, the one they called the Kid. His real name was Billy, and he was barely 19. He had fallen in with Kincaid's gang out of a mixture of youthful stupidity and a desperate need to escape a life of poverty. But the reality of being an outlaw was a far cry from the romantic stories he had grown up with. He had seen Kincaid's cruelty firsthand, and it had soured him. He saw the way Kincaid looked at Eleanor, the cold, calculating way he appraised her worth. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw a strength that he admired. He started to perform small acts of kindness, acts that went unnoticed by the others. He would make sure her water skin was full. He would slip her an extra piece of hardtack when Kincaid wasn't looking. He would speak to her in a quiet, respectful tone, a stark contrast to the leering taunts of Silas and Jed. One night, as he stood guard on the edge of the camp, Eleanor approached him. She had noticed his small kindnesses, his averted gaze, the flicker of shame in his eyes. "Why are you with them?" she asked, her voice a soft whisper in the darkness. Billy was startled. He looked around nervously, but the others were asleep. I didn't have much of a choice," he stammered. "There's always a choice," she replied, her voice firm, but not unkind. Her words struck a chord with him. He thought of his mother, a good, God-fearing woman, who would be heartbroken if she knew what he had become. He looked at Eleanor, at her bruised but unbroken spirit, and he felt a profound sense of shame. His internal conflict came to a head a few days later. They had made camp in a narrow canyon, and Jed, the hulking brute of the group, had been drinking heavily. He began to taunt Eleanor, his words growing more vulgar and threatening. Kincaid watched a smirk on his face, enjoying the cruel sport. Jed reached for Eleanor, his intentions clear. Suddenly Billy was there standing between them. "Leave her be, Jed," he said, his voice trembling but determined. Jed, drunk and enraged, turned on him. "What did you say, boy?" I said, "leave her be." Jed lunged at him, and the two of them went down in a flurry of fists and curses. Billy was no match for the bigger man, and Jed was quickly overpowering him. Kincaid and Silas watched, laughing. But then something unexpected happened. Silas, the rat-faced outlaw, who had always seemed to be Kincaid's most loyal follower, suddenly collapsed, clutching his stomach and gasping for breath. His face was pale and beaded with sweat. He had been complaining of a stomach ailment for days, a complaint that Kincaid had dismissed as weakness. The fight between Jed and Billy stopped. They all turned to look at Silas, who was now writhing on the ground in agony. Kincaid, his amusement replaced by annoyance, kicked at him. "Get up, you useless dog." But Silas didn't get up. He was dying. In his final gasping breaths, he looked at Kincaid with eyes full of hatred. "You left my brother to die in a shootout in Prescott," he rasped. "I swore I'd see you hang." He fumbled inside his shirt and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He thrust it towards Eleanor. "Take it. It's a map. To Kincaid's stash from the last bank job. Enough to buy your freedom." With a final shuddering gasp, Silas went still. The camp was slumped save for the crackling of the fire. The unexpected death and the dying man's confession had shattered the gang's fragile dynamic. Jed looked at Kincaid, his simple loyalty now shaken. Billy looked at Eleanor, a new, desperate hope in his eyes, and Kincaid for the first time looked vulnerable. The devil's bargain he had made with Blackwood was unraveling, and the ghosts of his past were closing in. The game had changed, and the odds were no longer in his favor. The death of Silas and his final desperate act of betrayal sent a shockwave through the outlaw camp. The map, a crudely drawn sketch on a piece of greasy paper, was now in Eleanor's possession. It was a dangerous piece of knowledge, a potential key to her freedom, but also a death warrant if Kincaid found out she had it. She hid it in the lining of her boot, her heart pounding against her ribs. The gang's morale, already frayed, began to disintegrate. Jed, the brutish enforcer, was now sullen and withdrawn. His simple, dog-like devotion to Kincaid, replaced by a simmering resentment. He had seen how quickly Kincaid had abandoned Silas, and it had planted a seed of doubt in his mind. Billy the Kid was now openly defiant. He saw the map as a sign, a chance to atone for his past mistakes and to save not only Eleanor, but also himself. The power dynamic had shifted. Kincaid, who had ruled through fear and intimidation, was now facing a rebellion from within his own ranks. He grew more paranoid, his temper more volatile. He knew that the woman, the boy, and the brute were all watching him, waiting for a moment of weakness. Billy and Eleanor began to conspire in hushed whispers, their conversations snatched in the dead of night or during the brief moments when Kincaid's back was turned. Billy, who knew the terrain, confirmed that the location on the map, a place called Eagle's Nest Peak, was a 2-day ride from their current position. It was a treacherous and secluded spot, the perfect place for a hidden stash, and also the perfect place for an ambush. They hatched a desperate plan. Billy would create a diversion, a ruse to draw Kincaid and Jed away from the camp. While they were gone, Eleanor would make a run for it. It was a long shot, a gamble with her life, but it was the only chance she had. Meanwhile, the circle was closing in from the outside as well. Nantan, the Apache tracker, had found the place where Silas had been buried in a shallow, hastily dug grave. He had also found the tracks of the fight between Jed and Billy. The story of the disintegrating gang was written in the dust for him to read. He knew that the outlaws were turning on each other, that their discipline was breaking down. He knew that the woman, as Eleanor, was still alive, and he knew that he was getting closer. He pushed himself harder, his movements becoming more urgent. He was no longer just a tracker. He was a hunter closing in for the kill. The desert, which had been his ally, now seemed to be testing him one last time. A sudden violent thunderstorm turned the dry arroyos into raging torrents, forcing him to take a longer, more circuitous route. He lost the trail for a precious few hours, and a cold fear, an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel for a long time, gnawed at him. He thought of the woman, of her courage and her resilience, and he pushed on his determination renewed. Back in Redemption, Sheriff Stone had finally decided to act. He had gathered enough circumstantial evidence to convince himself, if not a jury, of Blackwood's guilt. He rode out to the Blackwood ranch, not with a posse of hotheads, but alone. He found Blackwood in a drunken stupor, the ranch house in a state of even greater neglect than before. Stone confronted him with what he knew: the debt to Kincaid, the fabricated story of the Apache raid, the mail-order bride, who was nothing more than a bargaining chip. Blackwood, his face a mask of sweat and fear, at first denied everything. But under Stone's relentless, quiet questioning, his bravado crumbled, and he confessed the whole sordid story. He had met Kincaid in a high-stakes poker game in Prescott. He had lost everything, and Kincaid, instead of taking his life, had offered him a deal. Blackwood was to lure a wealthy woman from the east to the Territor, Uri, a woman whose family would pay a handsome ransom. He had chosen Eleanor, a woman with no close family to ask too many questions, but with a trust fund that would be released upon her marriage. The kidnapping had been staged, a brutal piece of theater, to convince the authorities that Blackwood was a victim. Stone listened to the confession with a growing sense of disgust. He arrested Blackwood not for his own safety, but to protect him from the justice that would surely be delivered by the townsfolk if they ever found out the truth. He now had a destination, Eagle's Nest Peak, the place Blackwood had confirmed was Kincaid's hideout, and the likely destination for the ransom exchange. The paths of the tracker, The sheriff and the outlaws were now converging on a single point on the map. The stage was set for a final violent confrontation. Eleanor, armed with a secret map and an unlikely ally, was about to make her move. Nantan, driven by a quest for vengeance and a newfound sense of duty, was closing in. And Sheriff Stone, a man of the law in a lawless land, was riding towards a reckoning that he knew would be paid in blood. The desert held its breath, waiting for the storm to break. The air at Eagle's Nest Peak was thin and cold. The jagged granite spire clawed at the sky, a sentinel overlooking the vast, desolate landscape. It was a place of isolation and stark beauty, a fitting stage for the final act of a brutal drama. Kincaid had chosen the location well. The peak was accessible by only one treacherous trail, making it a natural fortress. It was here in a shallow cave carved out of the rock face that he kept his ill-gotten gains and planned to receive the ransom for Eleanor. The plan for Eleanor's escape was set in motion at dawn. Billy, his face a mixture of fear and resolve, rode out of the camp, shouting that he had seen a rider in the distance, possibly the sheriff's posse. Kincaid, his paranoia now at a fever pitch, took the bait. He and a reluctant Jed saddled their horses and rode out to investigate, leaving Eleanor under the watchful eye of Billy, who had feigned an injury to his horse to justify staying behind. The moment they were out of sight, Billy turned to Eleanor. "Go," he said, his voice urgent. "Follow the trail down the east side of the peak. It's steep, but it will lead you to the plains. Don't stop for anything." He pressed a small, single-shot derringer into her hand. "It ain't much, but it's better than nothing." Eleanor, her heart pounding, didn't hesitate. She scrambled down the rocky slope, her city shoes slipping on the loose gravel. She was no longer the frightened, delicate woman who had arrived in redemption. The desert had stripped away her naivety, and in its place was a core of pure, unadulterated will to survive. Her escape was short-lived. Kincaid, his outlaw's intuition telling him he had been tricked, had not ridden far. He had doubled back, and he saw Eleanor making her desperate descent. With a roar of rage, he spurred his horse back towards the camp. What followed was a brutal, desperate chase down the mountainside. Eleanor scrambled over rocks and through thorny bushes. Her dress, tearing her hands and knees, scraped raw. Kincaid was closing in his face, a mask of fury. She reached a narrow ledge, a sheer drop on one side, and a wall of rock on the other. It was a dead end. Kincaid dismounted, a cruel smile on his face. "Nowhere left to run, little lady," he sneered, advancing on her. It was then that Billy appeared. He had followed Kincaid, his loyalty to Eleanor overriding his fear of the outlaw leader. He stood between them, his own gun drawn. "It's over, Kincaid," he said, his voice shaking but firm. Kincaid laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed off the rocks. "You're a fool, boy. You're throwing your life away for a woman who means nothing to you." "She means more than you ever will," Billy retorted. The standoff was broken by the sudden appearance of a third figure. Nantan, the Apache tracker, had arrived. He seemed to materialize out of the rocks, a silent, deadly presence. His face was a stoic mask, but his eyes burned with a cold, ancient hatred. He had a bow in his hand, an arrow nocked and ready. Kincaid was now trapped between his two former allies and the avenging Apache. His face, for the first time, showed a flicker of fear. "Nantan," he whispered the name, a curse on his lips. "You remember me, Kincaid?" Nantan said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You remember my wife. You remember my son." The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the wind whistling through the rocks. And then, as if the drama was not yet at its peak, another rider appeared on the trail below. It was Sheriff Stone, his face grim, his shotgun held at the ready. The devil's nest was now a cage, and the devil was trapped. The standoff exploded into a flurry of violence. Kincaid, seeing that he was surrounded, made a desperate move. He lunged for Eleanor, intending to use her as a human shield. But Eleanor was ready. She fired the small derringer Billy had given her. The shot went wide, but it was enough to make Kincaid stumble. In that moment of hesitation, Billy fired his own gun. The shot caught Kincaid in the shoulder, and he staggered back, roaring in pain and rage. He raised his own gun to fire at Billy, but before he could pull the trigger, an arrow, swift and silent, sprouted from his chest. He looked down at it in disbelief, a gurgling sound escaping his lips. He crumpled to the ground, his reign of terror finally at an end. Jed, who had been watching the scene unfold with a mixture of fear and confusion, threw down his gun and raised his hands in surrender. The silence that followed was profound. The wind howled around the peak, a mournful cry for the lives that had been lost and the innocence that had been shattered. Eleanor stood, the small gun still in her hand, her body trembling. Billy rushed to her side, his face a mixture of relief and sorrow. Sheriff Stone, his shotgun still raised, slowly approached the scene, his eyes taking in the carnage, and Nantan, his quest for vengeance finally fulfilled, stood over the body of his enemy. He looked not triumphant, but empty. The fire that had driven him for so long had been extinguished, and in its place was a vast, cold emptiness. He looked at Eleanor, at the woman whose life had become so inextricably linked with his own. He saw in her not a victim, but a survivor, a fellow warrior who had faced the darkness and emerged bruised but not broken. The truth in all its ugly, brutal detail was now laid bare on the rocks of Eagle's Nest Peak. The devil was dead, but the scars he had left behind would take a long time to heal. The journey back from Eagle's Nest Peak was a slow, funereal procession under a sky of bleached blue. The weight of what had happened hung in the air thicker than the dust kicked up by the horses' hooves. The bodies of Cain Kincaid and Silas, wrapped in canvas and slung over their saddles, were a grim, bouncing burden. Jed, his brutish bravado shattered, rode in chains, his gaze fixed on the dust, a man already imprisoned by his own failure. Beside Sheriff Stone, Billy rode in a state of quiet shock, his hands gripping the saddle horn as if it were the only solid thing in a world that had tilted off its axis. He was a boy caught between a past he regretted and a future he couldn't yet imagine. Eleanor rode beside Nantan, the silence between them a living thing. It was not an awkward silence, but one of deep shared understanding. The chattering, frightened woman from Boston was a ghost, a shedskin left somewhere on the trail. Eleanor looked at her hands raw and scraped from her flight down the mountain, the nails broken, the skin ingrained with dirt. They were not the hands of a lady, but they were her hands. They had fought, they had clawed, they had held a weapon. She felt the torn fabric of her dress a world away from the starched linens and delicate silks of her former life. She felt the sun on her face, no longer an assault, but a familiar, searing touch. She would look at Nantan, at his profile, carved from the very rock and canyons they traversed, and see a reflection not of savagery, but of a profound and unshakable harmony with this land that had nearly killed her and had then somehow given her life. As they neared redemption, Billy finally spoke, his voice cracking with youthful uncertainty. "Miss Vance, I'm sorry. For my part in it all. I never should have." Eleanor turned to him, her expression soft but unwavering. "You made a choice in the end, Billy. The one that mattered. That's more than most men can say." Her forgiveness was a quiet, unadorned gift, and it seemed to lift a palpable weight from the young man's shoulders. Their arrival in redemption brought the town to a standstill. Doors flew open, and people spilled into the dusty street. But the stares that met Eleanor were different now. The pity was gone, replaced by a raw, unvarnished awe. They saw not a victim, but a survivor. They saw the blood and dirt on her clothes, the exhaustion etched on her face, but they also saw the steel in her spine. Sheriff Stone rode at the head of their column, his face grim but satisfied, the architect of a just and bloody peace. The reckoning was swift. William Blackwood, pale and trembling, was brought from the town jail to be placed on a prison wagon bound for the territorial prison in Yuma, a place whose name was a curse whispered in the darkest corners of the territory. He saw Eleanor standing near the sheriff's office. For a moment his face contorted, a pathetic attempt to muster some indignation, some final blubbering accusation. "Eleanor," he began, his voice a weak whine. But the name died on his lips as he met her gaze. He saw no fear, no sorrow, not even the satisfying fire of hatred. He saw only a vast, calm indifference. He was a stone she had already stepped over, a memory she had already discarded. Without a word, she turned her back on him, a simple, final gesture that sealed his fate more completely than any iron bars. The circuit judge, a weary man named Elias Thorne, with eyes that had seen the worst of human nature, held court in the saloon. He listened intently as Sheriff Stone laid out the facts. He sentenced Jed to 20 years of hard labor in Yuma, a sentence that left the brute weeping silently into his manacled hands. Then he called Billy forward. The young man stood before him, head bowed. "Son," the judge said, his voice filling the suddenly quiet room, "this land tests a man, and it finds what he's made of. You started on a dark path, but when the moment came, you chose the light. This community is in your debt." He banged his gavel softly. "Suspended sentence. You'll work off your debt to this town at the livery stable. The next time I see you, I expect it to be as a man of good standing." A murmur of approval went through the crowd. Billy had been given a second chance, a rare currency in the unforgiving West. A few days later, the stagecoach was ready for its eastward journey. Eleanor stood before the ticket office, a small valise of donated clothes at her feet, and a ticket to Boston in her hand. The paper felt foreign, a flimsy promise of a world she no longer recognized. It was then that Nantan appeared, materializing from the shadows of the livery stable, as silently as he had from the rocks of Eagle's Nest Peak. "You go back to your world," he stated, his voice a low rumble. It was not a question. "It seems I must," she replied, though the words felt hollow. "There is nothing for me here." "Nothing?" he asked, his gaze sweeping over the rugged mountains that framed the town. "The desert does not change the rock. It only reveals its shape. Your shape was always there. You just could not see it in your world of soft things." He stepped closer and pressed something small and cool into her palm. She opened her hand and saw the single mother-of-pearl button. "I followed this," he said. "It was the first sign, not of a victim, but of a mind that was fighting, a sign of a warrior's heart." Eleanor stared at the button, this tiny, iridescent piece of her past. She looked at the stagecoach ticket, a passport to a gilded cage of expectations and meaningless social rituals. Then she looked up past Nantan to the vast open sky and the distant purple mountains. She saw not emptiness, but possibility. A harsh, dangerous, and beautiful freedom. A new certainty settled over her as solid and real as the ground beneath her feet. "I'm not getting on that coach," she said, her voice clear and strong. "My old life is a ghost. I will not be haunted by it." She tore the ticket in two, the sound a small, sharp punctuation to her new life. For the first time, a true smile touched Nantan's lips and reached his eyes. It was a rare and powerful sight, like a desert flower blooming after a long drought. He did not offer his help. He did not offer his company. He gave her something far more important, the acknowledgement of her own strength. "The path is now yours to make Eleanor Vance," he said. He gave a single deep nod of respect, turned and walked away. His figure receding with purpose into the vast landscape that was his home until he was gone. Eleanor did not watch him go. She turned and walked to the land office. Months later, the woman who had arrived seeking a husband was now a landowner in her own right. She learned the hard lessons of the land, her hands growing calloused as she built her own small cabin fence line by fence line. She learned to read the sky for rain and the ground for snakes. Billy, now a quiet and respected young man, would often bring her supplies from town, their shared ordeal having forged a bond of sibling-like friendship. Sometimes, in the quiet of dusk, as the setting sun painted the desert in hues of fire and rose, she would stand outside her cabin and look to the high ridges. And sometimes she would see him, a lone, still silhouette against the dying light, a silent guardian, a kindred spirit. He was a part of this land, and now so was she. She would raise a hand, not in a wave, but in a solemn gesture of acknowledgement, and a profound peace would settle over her. She had come west, seeking a home, and had found a nightmare. But through that nightmare she had found something far more valuable herself. The story of Eleanor Vance and the lone Apache tracker is a testament to the indomitable human spirit. It's a story that reminds us that courage can be found in the most unexpected of places, that heroes are not always the ones with the shiniest badges, and that sometimes the greatest treasures are not made of gold, but of the resilience we discover within ourselves when we are pushed to the very edge of survival. This was not just a tale of the Wild West, but a timeless drama of betrayal, redemption, and the forging of an unbreakable will. If this story of survival and unlikely alliances captivated you, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing it with others who love a good historical drama, and subscribing to our channel for more tales from the dusty, dangerous, and unforgettable American frontier. Your support allows us to continue bringing these incredible stories to life. Thank you for listening.